The Bride and the Crow. Once upon a time, in a secluded village, there lived a young bride and her mother-in-law. She was newly married and eager to fulfill her duties as a wife. One crisp morning, as the sun began to rise, the bride decided to venture into the forest to gather firewood. She had recently married a man who worked in the mines, and his mother, her new mother-in-law, had spun for her a beautiful woolen thread. The bride carried both an axe and the precious thread with her, determined to be of use. The forest was dense with towering trees, their branches thick with leaves, casting dapple shadows on the ground. The air was cool, and the scent of pine filled the air as the bride carefully made her way through the underbrush. Her eyes searched for the best timber, and as she walked, she thought of the chores awaiting her at home. Little did she know that her peaceful journey would soon take a surprising turn. As she ventured deeper into the forest, she suddenly heard a rustling sound. Startled, she froze and looked around, trying to make sense of the noise. She spotted a group of birds gathered in a clearing, seemingly having a lively discussion. Their voices were high-pitched, and they hopped about in excitement, their feathers glinting in the sunlight. The bride, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease, stepped back slowly, deciding to hide behind a large tree to avoid disturbing them. Just as she thought she was safe, a shadow passed over her, and to her surprise, a crow appeared out of nowhere, landing gracefully on a nearby branch. The crow's eyes glinted with a strange, knowing intelligence as it turned its head toward her and spoke in a deep, raspy voice, "Hello, how are you, bride?" The bride, her heart pounding in her chest, replied with a nervous smile, "I am fine, you majestic bird." The crow cocked its head, as though studying her closely. "What brings you to these woods, bride?" it asked in a tone that was both casual and curious. The bride hesitated but then answered, "I have come to gather firewood, to bring home to my husband." The crow looked at the pile of twigs and branches she had collected, its black feathers shimmering in the sunlight. "I see," it said thoughtfully. "But carrying all of this alone must be a burden. What if I help you?" The crow's eyes twinkled mischievously. "I can tie your wood for you, and it will be much easier to carry." Reluctantly, the bride nodded, feeling both grateful and nervous. "If you wish, majestic bird, I would be most thankful." The crow flew down and began arranging the wood, pecking and poking at the pile with surprising skill. It then used the bride's woolen thread to neatly tie the branches together, binding them with a series of expert knots. The bride watched in awe as the crow worked tirelessly. Within moments, the wood was bound tightly into a manageable bundle. The crow flapped its wings and looked at the bride. "There, your wood is ready," it said. "Now, promise me one thing." The bride, eager to leave, nodded. "What is it?" The crow's gaze became serious. "Promise me that you will not tell anyone about how I helped you today." Not a word, not a whisper. The bride, feeling a mix of fear and gratitude, agreed. "I promise, I will not say a word." With that, the crow took to the air, flying off into the distance as the bride, still holding the wood, made her way home. But as she walked through the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. When she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the crow following her, its black wings cutting through the air, circling above her. A chill ran down her spine, but she continued on her path, determined not to think too much of it. When the bride finally returned home, she unloaded the wood behind one of the huts, trying to ignore the ominous feeling that had settled over her. To her surprise, the crow had followed her all the way to the village. It landed at the cattle kraal, perching on a termite-infested wooden pole, its dark eyes never leaving her. That evening, as the bride cooked dinner, her mother-in-law came to her and asked, "Where did you gather all this wood, my daughter?" The bride, nervous but determined to keep her promise, answered, "I gathered it myself." Her mother-in-law smiled and nodded, not thinking twice about it. But as night fell and the bride prepared for bed, the crow, still watching, moved from the crow and perched on the roof of the mother-in-law's hut. Its presence was unsettling, but the bride did her best to ignore it. That night, as the bride slept, she was suddenly jolted awake by a vivid and terrifying dream. In the dream, the crow swooped down upon her, its sharp beak attacking her eyes and throat. The pain felt so real that the bride screamed out in horror, thrashing in the bed. She gasped for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Terrified, she ran to her mother-in-law's hut, throwing open the door and shouting, "Ma! The crow is trying to kill me." The mother-in-law, half asleep, looked around but saw nothing. The crow was still perched on the roof, as silent and menacing as ever. Concerned, the mother-in-law burned some incense, holding the bride close and allowing her to inhale the smoke. Slowly, the bride calmed, and the terrifying images of the dream faded. Her mother-in-law reassured her that the spirits of the night often play tricks, and with the calming effects of the incense, the bride was able to fall back into a peaceful sleep. The next morning, the bride, still feeling uneasy, decided to return to the forest to gather more firewood. As she entered the woods, she once again felt a strange presence. The crow appeared from nowhere, landing on a nearby branch and eyeing her with an intensity that made her shiver. "What did you tell your mother-in-law about me yesterday?" the crow demanded, its voice low and threatening. The bride, trembling, replied, "I kept my promise. I told her nothing." But the crow's eyes narrowed. "Lies and truth cannot coexist. I heard everything you told her last night. You broke your word." The bride placed her hands on her head, pretending to be confused, but the crow was unforgiving. With a loud caw, it lunged at her, pecking fiercely at her eyes, her stomach, and her face with its sharp beak. The bride screamed in agony as the crow's assault became more brutal. She tried to defend herself, but the crow was too fast, too powerful. The pain was unbearable, and she soon collapsed under the weight of the crow's fury. In the end, the bride's failure to keep her promise to the crow cost her dearly. The crow's vengeance was swift and merciless. The forest, once so peaceful, now seemed a place of endless shadows, and the bride's story became one that was whispered in hushed tones, a warning to all who might dare break their word. The crow, forever bound to the secrets of the forest, had claimed its price.